So a couple of days ago, it was April Fool's, and I was looking at my social media feed, and so many people were making the exact same joke. It went something like this. In November, I can't wait to vote for Donald Trump. Hashtag can't stomp the Trump. Hashtag vote Trump. Now, my Facebook feed would seem to indicate that the vast majority of youth are highly politically engaged because they're able to make these kinds of satirical comments. They're clearly paying attention to the upcoming presidential elections. They're clearly going to be voting at the polls. However, this isn't true. In fact, The Economist identified that in 2010, only 21% of youth aged 18 to 24 actually showed up to vote. That means 80% of people are sitting out of our democratic process. In fact, Circle, a Center for Political and Civic Engagement, identifies two major reasons why people don't come out to vote. First, they either say they're busy, they have work that overrides and is a priority over voting, or they believe that their voice doesn't count. However, both of these arguments are flawed. But in order to look at that, let's look first at the trends of political engagement over the past few years. Even though our generation cares so much about so many issues and that we are becoming more and more educated, we fail to connect this with the political process. For example, if you care about climate change, have you heard about the Climate Citizens Lobby, which has over 20,000 members and several prominent researchers? Or maybe you enjoyed watching the scenes in Interstellar and thought about the science and the physics behind all of that. But have you ever stopped to look at the amount of federal funding that NASA gets? Or perhaps you care about poverty and education. But have you seen how funds are allocated in our state legislatures and by the federal government? The fact is, most young people don't know the answers to this question. And that's not surprising because most of them don't even come out to vote. This graph shows that people ages 65 or older are almost doubling the rates of voting of people of our generation. And over the long term, the rates of voting have only decreased. This is problematic because policies made today impact our future. And they are disproportionately representing people who are much older than us, which means that we are going to be living with the consequences of these policies long after our majority old white male politicians are in the ground. So why is this? Well, there's been an increasing tide of anger and apathy towards politics, and it's easy to see why. Once, I also thought that way, and when we look at these headlines, which I pulled last night from Politico, CNN Politics, and the Wall Street Journal, we can see that their coverage is all about what's shocking. What did Trump say about Ted Cruz's wife, and vice versa? What is Bernie Sanders slinging at Hillary Clinton today, and vice versa? And things that Bill Clinton is doing. What is scandalous? What is shocking? Because what is shocking is sexy, and what is shocking sells. But the truth is that politics is not all of that. In fact, our popular culture would seem to indicate likewise. Okay. Ooh, okay. So most of you have probably watched House of Cards or Scandal. And both of these shows seem to indicate that politicians, by and large, place their personal ambition and power over actually creating public service. But I prefer to think of politics in terms of a maybe much older show that some of you may or may not have seen, which is called The West Wing. And The West Wing kind of espouses this can-do attitude in politics. The fact that people get elected in order to make change and work as hard as possible for their constituents. And that when these constituents speak up, this can result in real progress for a society. Now, I didn't always think this way. I preferred the more House of Cards, everybody is corrupt point of view and ideas about politics. But in my freshman year, I got involved with some political organizations, and I started going to a single phone bank in the region for a local candidate. And it's very interesting because, you know, I went there for like volunteer hours and like free pizza and things like that. And then people were like, well, you should come back next time. And I'm really bad at saying no, so I was like, okay, sure, I'll be back. And then I kept on coming, and so I kept on making calls, and I realized that the political process is a lot more about people. And the fact that people on the ground are calling, making hundreds of calls, knocking on doors to make sure that you come out to vote for their candidate. And that the political process is much less like House of Cards than the West Wing. And in fact, there's so many politicians out there who are demonstrating political courage day in and day out, but we're not going to see headlines about them. For example, Steve Israel, a representative from New York, wrote an op-ed for the New York Times talking about how campaign finance, the lack of campaign finance reform was ruining our democracy. But how many people are going to read that? Now, Senators John McCain, a Republican from Arizona, and Russ Feingold, a Democrat from Wisconsin, also worked together to pass campaign finance reform in 2002. But how many people would applaud that as political courage? In fact, we can find this on all kinds of levels of government. Paul Bridges is a Republican mayor from Georgia, and he protested a bill that would have been passed which would have made illegal immigrants, or basically drove illegal immigrants out of Georgia. He saw this as inhumane and spoke out against it, even though his party would have supported the policy. Now, these examples are everywhere. For example, Representative Bob Inglis, who's a ranking member on the Energy and Environment Committee, used to think that climate change was just a big hoax. He was like, this is not real. Climate change just doesn't exist. I don't believe in it. But after speaking to researchers, after visiting communities where the environment had been strongly impacted by climate change, he began to realize that it was actually real and that maybe he should do something about it. But few people have ever heard of Representative Bob Inglis, or maybe Representative Betsy Markey from Colorado, and who voted for extensions of healthcare benefits to people who are disadvantaged. Of course, she lost the next election, but she decided to do that because she believed that was right for her community. Likewise, Senator Elizabeth Warren is pretty well known for advocating for women's rights, as well as financial reform on Wall Street. And there are thousands and thousands of staffers who day in and day out on Capitol Hill, in the Senate, the House, and also in your local districts are striving to make sure that their constituents are being heard. They're the people who answer the phone when you call. They're the people who open when you knock on the door. And they're the people who try to get the right information to their policymakers, even if that information is biased sometimes. And sometimes we fail to appreciate that there's so many people working as public servants for our communities. In fact, politics is important because politics is about people. We live in a democracy, meaning that we should be able to vote for the laws that govern our society. These laws govern our struggles, our hardships, our achievements, our opportunities. Imagine, for example, if the 13th Amendment was never passed. Slavery is still legal. Now, even if every single slave owner in the country gave up their slaves, there's still that law that says that slaves are literally property. Then people are property. Your progress in society is not concrete unless if the government changes in response, which is why we need to connect our activism today outside of the political sphere to our government. Now, when we don't do this, we can see examples of places where politics has gone wrong. Now, for example, Mary Lou Bruner is actually in a runoff election in District 9 for the Texas Education Board. She believes a couple of very interesting things. First of all, well, climate change is unreal. We've heard that a couple of times. Second, that the United Nations is ready to bomb the populations of the world in order to reduce population growth, which is very interesting. And third of all, that President Obama was a gay prostitute who needed to make some extra money so he could buy drugs. Now, the range of political views in this room might span from very liberal to very conservative, but I don't think any of the conservatives in here believe that Obama was once a gay prostitute. But this woman has the potential to actually be writing our textbooks. She has the potential to be changing our education curriculum. And how many people have heard of her? How many people actually showed up to vote in her district? Well, very few, which allowed her to make it this far in the race. As I said before, the laws we make today affect the generations of tomorrow. And one prominent example that affects us here in Texas is campus carry. Now, the UT Austin and the University of Texas system in general was very much against campus carry, and thus they proposed an amendment that would allow public schools to opt out of the system and allow their campuses to remain gun-free. So campus carry allows you to carry a concealed weapon as long as you're on the campus, but policymakers didn't listen because the vast majority of those policymakers were elected by constituents who saw that we should have guns on campus, even though the students might have disagreed. And so SB 11 passed without the amendment that allowed people to opt out, and Texas public colleges today cannot opt out, which means that when you walk on campus next year, if you're going to UT Austin, there's a very high likelihood that, you could just purchase a gun and carry it around with you. Now, whether or not that's dangerous is up for political debate, but whether or not you agree with that becomes muted when other people are voting for people who should be representing you. Now, there's also this issue of gay marriage, for example. 81% of people in my age group, 18 to 29, believe that gay marriage should be legal. But in the past few weeks alone, we've seen countless laws being proposed in state legislatures which legalize discrimination against people based off of their gender identity. This, most of us would agree, is wrong. But why are policymakers creating this? I would say it's a failure for us to connect to the political process. And we can also see this with the minimum wage. 78% of people my age believe that the minimum wage should be raised so that more people can earn more money, and this could stimulate the economy. However, time and time again, proposals to raise the minimum wage have stalled in Congress. Now, this isn't to say that everything is lost. In fact, one of the best things we can do is encourage student engagement in the political process. When I show up to phone banks and things like that, people are usually quite surprised because most people there could be my grandparents. And they'll be like, you're not in high school, or were you forced here? Or like, why are you actually here? I really want to know. And so, your voice has a big impact. People want you to be there. People want you to get involved. And there are ways for you to make change. In this top photo here, one of my friends in South Dakota actually organized a protest against a discriminatory bill which would discriminate against transgendered students. After that protest, it was called a legislative coffee. So basically, politicians are having coffee and you're kind of like, no, this is wrong, stop. And so after that, the bill actually did not pass. We can also see some students were meeting with their representatives in Alabama in order to protest the terrible state of sexual education that they had in the state. Because of the high pregnancy rates that they were experiencing, they believed that the curriculum needed to be changed. And we have students who are introducing Bernie Sanders at his rallies before thousands of people. And we have students who are being elected as delegates for Hillary Clinton to district and state conventions. So clearly there is room for students to be in the process. It's a question of whether or not you want to get engaged. And there are people who are joining the political process by running for office. For example, Erin Schrody is 24 in California. She's running to become a representative for her district. And Sarah Blair, age 17, is actually the youngest elected official in the United States. But you don't have to run for office. And you don't have to be a political science major. You don't have to show up at every campaign rally. In fact, the first thing you can do is vote and make an informed vote. And then what else? You can ask your community members to vote. You can drive people to the polls. And you can also make calls. You can also knock on doors. But these are all things you can do without having to become a campaign manager or run for office. And you can also lobby for the issues that you care about. So for example, I've listed here the NEA. If you care about education reform, working together with the NEA could be a good idea. Making calls to your congresspeople. If you believe that the debt is a huge problem, perhaps consider fixing the debt. Or Emily's List, which helps pro-woman politicians get elected to Congress. If you care about women's rights and the fact that women should receive equal pay, then perhaps Emily's List is the organization you want to join. Now, this is a sampling of hundreds of organizations out there that could be advocating for any kind of issue you believe in, because politics is intrinsically entwined with almost every single issue. Are you an environmentalist? Have you lost someone to cancer or disease? Do you believe that we should have reform for some kind of policy? Do you believe that something is wrong in society? As long as there's an issue you care about, there's a way for you to communicate this to your policymakers. And so the question is, what do you care about and how will you sit at the table? I hope that after the talk today, you will think more about how you're going to become more politically engaged, especially as you move on to college, especially as you move on throughout life. How will you make sure that the progress you want to see becomes concrete? How will you make sure that our society becomes better, not just in terms of what you are willing to give outside of government, but what is government going to do for you? Thank you.